Timothy Garton Ash, a name I think you all will recognise, obviously you wouldn't be here otherwise, but some will know him from his books, some from his columns in The Guardian and so many other publications, even The Spectator, when The Spectator was, shall we say, journal of record, and he was the political editor of that, and many other things. So he's been able to combine this career in academia with a career in journalism and also, dare I say it, in diplomacy. His day job is being Professor of European History at St. Anthony's College. But he also has a foot in the other camp. He's also a fellow at Stanford University. So at these times where there's so much going on both sides of the Atlantic, I think there's no better person to bridge that particular gap. I think it would be impossible to overstate Timothy's achievements over his career. He's often been described as the foremost historian of the present in the UK, if not further afield. He was voted by Time magazine to be one of the 100 most influential, not only the 100 most influential thinkers, but one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and many of the others are politicians. I make a distinction because so many people who are influential are not necessarily thinkers, but he certainly is both. So if I just say one more thing, I mean there's so much I could say, but one more thing is to mention the Charlemagne Prize, which I think is probably one of the greatest achievements that any non-politician could have, because he's one of the very few non-politicians to have been awarded it. And this is a prize awarded by the City of Aachen for people who have furthered the cause of European unity. And if I say that among the other prize winners have been 3 British Prime Ministers, Bill Clinton, Kissinger, Macron, Merkel and the Pope, 2 popes, you'll get some idea of what distinguished company he's in. Having said that, I certainly look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say about the current state of Europe and the world. And I know Timothy always sets his own agenda, so I shall look forward to learning more. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. One thing to be said about that list of 100 most influential people in the world is that you're only there for 1 year and then you disappear and you cease to be influential anymore. It's wonderful to be here, delighted to see you all wrapped up so warm. And I want to start by saying a huge word of appreciation to Peter Burt and all the other organisers, because you've done an amazing job in keeping this organisation going for many, many years in difficult circumstances. Perhaps a round of applause for Peter. I should also warn you that my head had a bit of an argument with a door in Bratislava the other day, and the door somewhat won. So if I become more than usually incoherent, it's because of that Slovak door. And now that said, I want to start right here in this church, which I must admit I've never been in my life, although I've lived in Oxford for 45 years, and in Bonn Square, which is perhaps not the most elegant or picturesque corner of Oxford, except perhaps for the pigeons. But then you haven't seen Oxfordstrasse in Bonn, which is even more gloomy. But if you make the following thought experiment, take Oxford, remove all street signs and shop notices, everything that could tell you it's Oxford, England, and plonk down someone from anywhere in the world to walk around the centre of Oxford and ask them, where are you? And they would say, well, I'm not quite sure, but we're certainly in Europe, right? There is absolutely no doubt that this is a European city, even for those who don't know that the first recorded scholar here was Theobald of Étampes from Caen in Normandy, who is recorded as a Master of Oxford in 1096. So we've been a European city and a European university forever. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, we've just elected our 160th recorded Chancellor of the University of Oxford, William Hague. But of course, the same can be said of Britain. Britain is self-evidently still in Europe. Every single known atlas of the world, starting with Eratosthenes in the 2nd century BC, Ptolemy, all the way through, show Britain in Europe. I actually once asked the librarian, the map librarian at the British Library, whether he knew of any historical map that didn't show Britain in Europe. And he said no, there was no such map. So geographically we're in Europe. Historically it's impossible, simply impossible, to write the history of Europe without Britain, or the history of Britain without Europe. Culturally, the history of Europe without Shakespeare, but also of this country without Europe. Fintan O'Toole rather wonderfully points out in one of his articles, or maybe it's his book, that John of Gaunt, who is of course the man who speaks the famous Sceptred Isle speech in Shakespeare, was actually Jean of Ghent. That's why he's John of Gaunt, he was Jean of Ghent. But we're also European in more recent and, in a sense, stronger ways. So if you look at the structure of our state and society, the fact that we have this really major welfare state and national health service and public education system, this is characteristically European, right? I mean, could be Canada, could be New Zealand, but basically, if you've got an analyst of public spending who just looked at the figures of our public spending, they'd say, I bet you that's a European country. And also in more recent ways. Because actually in the last 50 years, we've become more European. So a lovely story that Leszek Kołakowski, the great Polish philosopher, the author of the main accounts of Marxism, who was a fellow of All Souls for many years, used to tell, was that when he arrived in Oxford, I think in 1970, he wandered around the city, which he didn't know, and then he came back home and Tamara, his wife, said, how is it? And he said, well, you know, it's absolutely beautiful, incredibly beautiful, but one thing I don't understand, where are the cafes? Well, in Oxford at that time, 50 years ago, some of you will remember, there were no cafes, there were cafes, George's and Brown's in the covered market. And when you asked for a coffee, you got, anyone remember this? Chicory essence, poured from a bottle, liquid chicory essence into a mug, and then some hot water on top. But now, where are the cafes? Well, you can't walk 50 meters without encountering a cafe. And all sorts of ways in which the life of our country, not just of this city, have become much more distinctively contemporary European, including, of course, the fact that we have so many fellow citizens or fellow residents who are from continental Europe. Not only those many, many people who are now, you know, from mixed families, mixed marriages, one parent from somewhere in continental Europe, but when we got the final figures on those with a permanent right to remain post-Brexit, you know, we used to say 3 million, 3.5 million, but it's between 5 and 6 million people. It's an amazing figure. Now, not all of them are here, because some of them, Poles and other East Europeans, have gone back, but all of them have a right to be here. I actually want to start, I want to commend to you a campaign, which I want to start, which is for all of them to take British citizenship. Not only because if you live in a country, it's a good thing to participate in its democratic life, but also because, think about it, 5 million voters is quite an electoral force. That would have longer term an impact on our policy towards Europe. So I commend that to you if you have any friends who are EU citizens. But also in the following more significant even geopolitical respect. So the two key institutions, geopolitically, of contemporary Europe are, of course, the EU and NATO. And if one were to be a really consistent sovereigntist, you should argue that Britain should leave both EU and NATO, as Enoch Powell, by the way, who was nothing if not consistent, argued that you should leave, because if you believe in true national independence and sovereignty, unqualified sovereignty, but no, we left the EU, but of course we didn't leave NATO. Why? Because we think that's sort of the Americans. But actually, the concrete implication of NATO, am I wandering out of shot? Okay, Peter, I won't wander too far. The concrete implication is, of course, that we are committed to the defense of European countries, and with the eastward enlargement of NATO, that means that we are committed to the defense of Romania, Poland, the Baltic states, now Finland. And ironically enough, the year after this country, by a narrow margin, voted for Brexit, 2017, we stationed British troops in Estonia, right on the frontier to Russia. So already the fact that we had forces permanently stationed on the European continent was a departure from our pre-1945, or rather pre-1939 history. The historian Michael Howard wrote a wonderful book called The Continental Commitment, explaining what a departure it is for Britain to have armies permanently stationed on the continent of Europe. But 2017, it's not just stationed in Germany, West Germany. You're stationed in Estonia, right on the frontier of Russia. So people loosely say Britain has, quote unquote, left Europe. But what's this nonsense about leaving Europe, a country which has troops stationed in Estonia, committed to the defense of Eastern Europe? So in that important geopolitical way, we remain in Europe. And this brings us to a theme which is going to recur, which is an old one in our history, which is the tension between, to put it at its simplest, our security policy commitment and our economic policy commitment, right? And the dissonance between those two. So that's a few little reasons why Oxford and Britain remain in Europe. But of course, Oxford for Europe is saying more than Oxford in Europe, or saying for Europe. And Britain has, alas, left the EU. And I suspect there are many people in this room who don't regret that. I'm not going to say hands up anyone who regrets that, because it might be put you on the spot, but I suspect not. I suspect, and I am going to ask for hands up on this, quite a few of you were with me on one of the marches for a second referendum. Hands up, who was on a march for the second referendum? I guess that's a couple of carriages full in the train on the way up. I've never forgotten, by the way, getting on the train and suddenly realizing it was full of people, all of whom were going to the march. And wasn't it a great moment? You know, I say in my book, Homeland, that the two largest pro-European demonstrations I have seen in the last quarter century were in Kiev during the Orange Revolution and in London for the second referendum. Remember the Duke of Wellington's house wreathed in European flags. Remember those wonderful posters. One I remember, don't blame the Bulgarians and Romanians, blame the Etonians. And that I have to say, slightly incurably middle-class poster, because this was about at the time of Theresa May's so-called deal. Quote, "I can get a better deal at Waitrose." But it remains in my mind a great moment, and in a sense, this country, in my view, became even more conscious of its Europeanness because of Brexit, right? So the great Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz, his most famous poem begins, "Lithuania, thou art like health. How much we must value you, those alone know who have lost you." And if you put Europe instead of Lithuania, I think there's that feeling in this country that we value it even more, because in the sense of the EU, we've lost it. Now, even before the 24th of February 2022, Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the costs of Brexit were already becoming clearly apparent. Everyone focuses on the economic cost, which is clear, particularly in trade, specifically trade in goods, and above all for small and medium-sized enterprises. They're the ones who've been hardest hit. And actually many small and medium-sized companies whose principal export market was continental Europe, the EU, have stopped exporting altogether because it's become so difficult and so expensive, so much red tape to export to Europe, continental Europe, that if kind of 70% of your export business is gone, then it just wasn't worth it to carry on with the little bits you were doing as well. So it's had a clear impact. If you look at the line of the trade figures in particularly trade in goods, not so much in services. The estimates cumulative loss of GDP between 4 and 6%. But of course, most people don't feel a statistical loss of GDP, but the trading loss is palpable. But in my view, even more palpable and immediate is the loss in international influence, reputation, and soft power. I mean, we were in such an amazingly privileged situation, say 15 years ago, the time of the London Olympics, which for me is a wonderful moment. I actually begin my chapter in the book about Brexit with that incredible moment of the Queen jumping out of the plane, if you remember, followed by James Bond. Because we really had the best of both worlds, right? We were extremely well placed in Europe, but also in the Anglosphere and the rest of the world. And it's not just that we lost one of them, we've lost a good deal of both of them. I asked a very senior American diplomat a couple of months ago, how much less important has Britain become to the United States because of Brexit? And his answer, without hesitation, he looked at me, he said, much less important. Yeah, so much for our great special relationship with. And in continental Europe, I mean, I spend a lot of my time in places where, you know, Spaniards are talking to Poles, and French are talking to Germans, and Italians are talking to Swedes, so they kind of forget there's a Brit in the room. Britain doesn't feature at all. We're just out of it. And the Germans say, weg vom Fenster, out of the window. And amazingly, even in the discussions about European security, even when there was a discussion about nuclear security, when we are one of the two nuclear powers, and actually the only one whose nuclear deterrence is committed to the defense of NATO territory, it was all about France. Yeah? So the impact already before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was already very large. But on top of that comes, if we're thinking about our position in Europe, and Europe as a whole, first the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, on the 24th of February 22, and secondly, on the 5th of November this year, the election of Donald Trump. And those two developments between them place the whole of Europe in a dramatically new situation. With, on the one hand, Putin pushing forward from the east, and on the other hand, Trump plausibly, credibly intending to withdraw the United States from the West. I will now for a moment step back and look at the wider European context and then come back to Britain. So in Homelands, I argue that we have lived through two periods in recent European history. The post-war period, post-1945, subject of Tony Judd's great book, Post-War, and what I call the post-war period, the period that goes from the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 to the 24th of February 2022. And that period is over. Now, beginnings in history, as in life, as in romance, are particularly important. Think about the first 5 years after 1945. In just those 5 years, we created the structures and institutions of international order in which we're still working to this day, right? Nearly 80 years later. Shaped in just those 5 years. In the 5 years after 1989, we shaped a European order which lasted for the next 30 years. So beginnings matter. And now, we're in year 3, post-2022, coming to the end of year 3, we're not doing very well. We haven't created anything comparable in response to these double challenges, and the war in Ukraine is going back. I've been in Ukraine 6 times since the beginning of the full-scale war, and each time it's become more depressing. If I think about how we characterize this new era, obviously it's too soon to say, it's for future historians, but let me just suggest very quickly 7 features, and then I'll come back in the last bit to Britain. First of all, war has returned to our continent. Of course, we had the wars in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, but they were relatively small, although very horrible wars. And actually, we did a fairly good job, not of ending the one in Bosnia, but of ending the one in Kosovo and preventing one in Macedonia, which people forget. In Ukraine, we have the largest war in Europe since 1945. The dead and wounded at the front are now almost certainly over 1 million. Over 1 million. Ukrainian and Russian killed and wounded. I don't know a single Ukrainian who doesn't have a close friend or family member who's been killed or wounded. Every time I go, I visit the military cemetery in Lviv, and every time there's another, row of graves. And at the moment, Ukraine is losing, and Donald Trump is a great threat to its future. And of course, I have to mention the wars around Israel and the Middle East, which have a big impact on our society. So the return of war. Secondly, we have the rise of hard-right populist nationalist parties way beyond the level that we were used to them until about 10 years ago. So, until about 10, 15 years ago, it was 5, 10, maybe 15%, but there was a kind of ceiling. Now it's 20, 25, 30, 35. In the East German Länder, well above that. In France, Marine Le Pen. And several of them are in government, in Hungary, for example, in Italy, in the Netherlands. Thirdly, we have a dire economic situation. The German economy now is in a terrible state, the central economy of the EU. Fourth, we are going through a technological revolution, a major technological revolution, which is also impacting our entire information ecosystem through social media. This is an immense challenge. And we as Europe as a whole are somewhere in terms of trying to regulate, but absolutely nowhere in terms of innovation, which is really what's so important here. If you look at AI, it's the United States, China, a little bit of Britain, and almost nothing in Europe. So we are missing out in important ways on this technological revolution. Climate change, we've just passed the first full 12-month period where global average temperatures were above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which, as you remember, is in theory the original target. We're nowhere near holding even to the 2-degree target. The United States, this is 0.6. It's not just Trump. Trump is, of course, Trump, a unique individual, thank heaven. But he is also a kind of hypertrophied expression of a much longer term trend, which goes back at least 25 years. So again, the story I tell in the book is being summoned to brief George W. Bush before his first official visit to Europe in 2001. And one question he asked us is, do we want the European Union to succeed? And ironically enough, there were 5 of us, and it was the 2 Brits, Lionel Barber and myself, who hurried to say to him, yes, Mr. President, you must want the European Union to succeed, right? But no American president before the end of the Cold War would have thought to answer that question, because it was obvious to the United States that it was in their national interest to have a strong Western Europe in the context of the Cold War. Now the question is asked, and actually through the George W. Bush presidencies, through Obama also, and through Trump, you have this trend of a declining US commitment and interest in Europe. Partly for cultural reasons, partly for demographic reasons, partly for economic reasons. And now under Trump, that's going to be turbocharged, right? It's either turning inward, nation building at home, or Asia first. But it's certainly not Europe. And that's a huge challenge to us because we've depended on the United States for our security for 80 years. Finally, my 7th defining feature of this new period is one of the most important. What the war in Ukraine has revealed is that we are now in a post-Western world, right? So not in the sense that the West no longer exists, because it still exists, the West are rich and powerful, but in the sense that there are enough major, great and middle powers, non-Western or only partly Western, China above all, Russia, India, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, which are rich and powerful enough, partly thanks to the globalization that we led, to counterbalance the West. So we threw the kitchen sink at Russia in terms of sanctions. Unprecedented wave of sanctions. And the Russian economy is doing better than ours. It's growing faster than ours. Because all those other countries are perfectly happy doing business with Russia. So those 7 features together form a huge challenge to Europe as a whole. And I'd be happy in discussion to answer questions about France, about Germany, about Poland, about Italy, whatever you want. But in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to turn back to Britain and Oxford for Europe. Now, ironically, Britain today suddenly has one of the most stable, sensible, centrist governments in Europe. What a change that makes. Anyone here miss Liz Truss? Yeah, I felt not. And this government is seriously engaged on a quote-unquote reset with our European partners. And Starmer and David Lammy and John Healey are actually doing a great job diplomatically and rhetorically. I thought Starmer driving down the Elysee with President Macron was a great sight. And continuing the one thing which, in my view, one could be really proud of under the last couple of Conservative governments, namely support for Ukraine. I mean, this government is as solid and it's a cross-party consensus. Unfortunately, sorry, that's where the good news ends. First of all, in order to win this election big, Starmer and Labour set those very strong red lines. No customs union, no single market, no freedom of movement, and at the same time set very, very, very modest goals which are actually extremely difficult to achieve. Things like a better deal for our musicians and artists inside the EU, or mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or regulatory alignment for the chemical industry. These are very, very difficult to achieve unless you go to the bigger picture. I mean, in a way, it's the worst possible combination for politicians, right? To have very, very restrictive red lines on the one hand and very, very modest but difficult to achieve goals. And alas, these are now being interpreted such that even the EU's offer of a youth mobility scheme, which is something we should want, is being rejected because it's quote-unquote freedom of movement. That's Yvette Cooper and the Home Office. And then comes Trump, right? Trump, who on the one hand is, I'm afraid, very likely to pull the rug out from under Ukraine. That I find extremely painful, but it's likely. Now, in terms of the British relationship with Europe, continental Europe, that's in a way, ironically, good news. Because that means there's more need of Britain in the security cooperation for Ukraine. So interestingly, I met Friedrich Merz, who's the likely next Chancellor of Germany, the Christian Democrat in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and he is talking about a new collaboration, he calls it a contact group, Germany, France, Poland, and Britain, to support Ukraine. So that brings us closer. But on the other hand, the first thing Trump is going to do is slap on the tariffs. As you know, he famously said tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. And he's going to slap them on the EU, China, Canada, Mexico. But he's also said he's going to slap them on us, on Britain. Right? But at the same time, there are siren voices who are singing special relationship, right? Who are saying, actually, because you're outside, by the way, I once heard Helmut Schmidt say, the special relationship is so special that only one side knows it exists. Not for nothing, but he knows Schmidt the lip. But actually, because we're outside the EU, and sort of because of our financial services and all that stuff, and because Trump, you know, who is this totally perverse, narcissistic, but unpredictable character, sort of has a soft spot for Britain. You know, oddly enough, Scottish golf courses play a role here, and also he thinks he's great friends with the royal family. I don't know if any of you have seen the video online of him. Have you seen that? On a plane, sort of lingering over a photo album and saying things like, oh, there's the Queen, I get on really well with her, she's a great friend of mine, and so on. But anyway, because of these kind of weird contingent elements, you know, there is just a possibility that we could cut a special deal and maybe have lower tariffs. And if you read the FT, there are people there saying, why hitch yourself to the European Museum when you could hitch yourself to the American locomotive economically? And I think there's going to be a real temptation inside government to try to go down that path. Okay? Now, Kim Darroch, who's our former British ambassador to Washington, and who had this issue in the first Trump term, says, well, you're very quickly going to come up against some big problems. You want a trade agreement with the US? They will want free access for all their agricultural goods to Britain, including chlorinated chicken. Farmers who've just been told they're going to have to pay inheritance tax on their farms are not going to be very happy about that. But I think nonetheless the temptation will be there to try and detach ourselves from our European partners and, you know, get that special deal. Peter Mandelson, remember him? Said the other day, was quoted the other day in the New York Times saying, I quote, "We have got to find a way to have our cake and eat it." Anyone remember having our cake and eat it? Boris Johnson, cakeism? Well, heaven help us all. Now we have Peter Mandelson advocating. It's not going to work. It is a genuine choice. Either we have to go more with the US, or we have to go more with Europe, with the European Union. Now, sadly, by the way, when I was speaking here, I looked this church up in Pesna, as one does. It has a very, very short entry. Few descriptions, 1819, and then he says, as a characteristic of Pesna, quote, "Not a well-integrated composition." Well, I think that's what one could say about the Starmer government's European policy. Not a well-integrated composition. It really is not coherent. There isn't a clear strategy behind it. There was a strategy for winning the election, but not for what the actual policy is, particularly with the arrival of Trump. And therefore, individual players actually have to take different positions. Lamy and Starmer himself, and Reeves, and Nick Thomas Simmons, and Douglas Alexander, and so on. They all have slightly different, and Yvette Cooper, slightly different positions. What should we, and this is my last few sentences, as British Europeans, as Oxford for Europe, try and push on? I think we should push on a few specific small things. Erasmus, coming from Oxford, the objection has been the price tag, but the symbolic and human and cultural importance is massive. The youth mobility scheme. It's completely crazy that the EU is coming to us and asking us for something which is very much in our own long-term interest. And we are saying, no, no, no. Okay? So what we should do is take students and short-term youth visitors out of the immigration statistics, which is what we should have done long ago, so the numbers aren't terrifying, and then take that youth mobility scheme. There are lots of things you can do. You can have a limit to it, a limited time, limited numbers, etc., etc. And then we should push very hard on this strategic point, which is coming up in the next few months, which is you've got this choice about economic policy. You've got to go with your biggest single market. Even if you're not a passionate European like me or most of us in this room, because it's our biggest single market. You've got to go with the EU and use this as an opportunity to craft a closer economic relationship with the EU in the context of a potential trade war, because otherwise you're going to be back in this situation where your right hand is coming closer to Europe on security policy, but your left hand is going closer to the United States on economic policy, or your legs, so you're doing the splits. And that seems to be the crucial point, because if we can make that point and get that coherent policy, and it's a live issue at the moment, then down the road, towards the end of this parliamentary term, the question of customs union and single market is posed, right? Because if you're going that way, then it only makes sense to go for customs union at least, and if you can face the freedom of movement, single market. So best case, I think we can get to the point where towards the end of this parliamentary term, there's at least a serious political discussion about putting it to the voters, because I think it has to be in an election campaign, that we should rejoin the customs union, or a new customs union. And by the way, I hope the Lib Dems would then have the courage of their European convictions and come out for it. And then, who knows what happens in the 2030s. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I think we should all try to go from Bonn Square on this chilly autumn evening. I look forward very much to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Phenomenally insightful and moving talk from Timothy, and I can add to what he just told us about the 6 trips to Ukraine and the moving columns about his many friends there. His most recent one in September?
September, yes. Yeah.
Kharkiv, which is not a place that anybody would go who doesn't have phenomenal courage and dedication. So that speaks for itself. So having said that, I've got some questions online, but over to you. Okay, John.
John Tanner, Oxford for Europe.
Thank you very much.
Really good. I think we should do another round of applause. But what I'd like to ask, if I may, is about the Conservative Party. About the Conservative Party, people will remember them. I think one of the problems is in our negotiation, our closer links with the rest of Europe, is that they don't really know yet that we speak for the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
Because you can't really have a situation where you've got a youth scheme, where you've got a customs union under a Labour or a Liberal Democrat government, but under a Tory government, you then reject it all. How do we get over that and make it a British negotiation or renegotiation?
By winning the next election. I'm serious. Because at the moment, clearly the Conservative Party is an overwhelmingly Eurosceptic party, and it's gone to the right, because that's absolutely clear. But there is a pattern in British politics, isn't there, when parties go into opposition. First time in opposition, they tend to go to the extremes. They think Labour in the 1980s, right? And then after a second lost election, with luck, they think the election is only to be won in the centre, so they come back to the centre. So that was, Labour coming back to the centre in the 1990s, and it was the Tories coming back to the centre. So that would be the hope. And meanwhile, life has moved on, things are a very different conversation. Brexit would then be, 15 years ago. Dare I say, the age structure of the population would be slightly different, which is also helpful in this respect. So that, I think, would be our best chance of doing that. But there aren't many Conservatives for Europe at the moment, I can tell you that, because I think I know them all. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pat. I'm in the Labour Party in Buckinghamshire, so in Oxford for Europe. My question is, how do we bring the working class, especially the white working class, along for the ride? Because I think that's one of the challenges that we've got at the moment.
so the question for those is, how do we bring the white working class along? It's a great question. I mean, it's a broader question than about Europe, isn't it? It's in a way a question about liberalism with a small l, thinking about small l liberals, left, centre and right. Because of course Europe as a project is associated in people's mind with liberalism more broadly, and also with globalization and free markets and all of that. So let me give you a very short answer, because we could spend the whole evening on this. Francis Fukuyama wrote a rather wonderful essay analyzing Trump's victory, in which he said there were two big problems with liberalism. Crude shorthand, neoliberalism on the one hand, quote-unquote woke liberalism on the other, right? So neoliberalism, shorthand for globalized, financialized capitalism, massive economic inequality, white working class being left behind because the jobs went to China or India. Woke liberalism, I don't like the word, but shorthand for liberals were seen as paying lots of attentions to every other minority except for the white working class. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to all those other minorities. It means we should also pay attention to the white working class. So I think we need, a pretty drastic bit of liberal self-criticism, quite radical reform of the liberal agenda to address those two problems. And that way, maybe you begin to get the white working class back on board, because at the moment they've gone to the populists.
I'm going to go to online questions for a moment, if I might. I've got a very good question from Peter Harbour, who makes many of the points that we've heard already, but he asks, in terms of responding to skeptics, what steps we have to take to educate and inform the public and our leading politicians so that we can actually be realistic in our progress towards rejoin? And how can politicians be persuaded to keep options open, to keep ideas on the table, and to seek to plan solutions to overcoming problem steps instead of surrendering as soon as the problem is identified? So about education.
Educating politicians.
If it's possible.
So when I started out writing about European politics in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of politicians who had either fought in the Second World War or served in the forces in continental Europe or had other business in continental Europe, and there were very close ties between the main political parties. So at that time, the Tories and the Christian Democrats, and remember at that point, the Tories were the pro-European party, and Labour was the Eurosceptic party, had very close ties. The Liberals, of course, had close ties. Labour had close ties with social democratic parties. So there was this whole rich web of connections between our political class and the continental political class. And that has been dramatically weakened, in many cases cut. So the number of MPs now who seriously know anything about continental Europe and the EU is rather dramatically diminishing. And by the way, also who speak any European languages. The figures on German are quite shocking. Last year, I got the figures for 2023, less than 35,000 doing German at GCSE, less than 2,500 A-level German. GCSE is pretty basic. So that, I think an important part of the answer to that question is trying to restore this web of ties in different ways, in all the ways we can. And by the way, our university has a part to play in that. And I plead, talking about self-criticism a moment ago, a bit of self-criticism. I spent my life in the European Studies Centre at the university here. We do, if I may say so, not a bad job with graduate students. So we have an amazing set of events with graduate students, but we very little reach to British undergraduates. Right? Quite a few of whom go on to be MPs, right? Some of them Prime Minister. So sort of simple things like actually getting European studies to British undergraduates, so people come out of university with their first degree with some real understanding. You know, even on the Today program, they sometimes get the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council mixed up. That's a very partial answer. Yeah, there was a guy right at the back.
This is Graham Harris. I'm an Oxfordshire resident, not an organisation as such. My question relates to a policy, a present policy issue that you've alluded to in your talk, and that's, is Europe capable of taking more responsibility for its own defence in terms of its putting the economic input into generating a big army air force, particularly Germany? And if they are able to achieve that, what impact would that possibly have on the perception of the relevance of the European project and the European Union as a whole to the British people?
That's a great question. So, up till now, the answer has clearly been no. I've just reviewed Angela Merkel's memoirs. I'm not going to say you should rush out and buy a copy. 700 pages, of which 100 are fairly interesting and the rest are fairly boring. But one thing she reminds us of is that even after Putin's seizure of Crimea and the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine, when NATO in Wales set the target of spending 2% of GDP on defence, Germany's defence spending went from, wait for it, 2014 1.15% of GDP to dramatically increased 1.33% in 2021, right? So we didn't. And actually, it took the combined impact of Putin and Trump to start people saying they're getting to 2%, although I have to tell you, the things people count to get to 2% are nobody's business. You know, development aid, and officials in the defense ministry, heaven knows what. Now, what I would say to you is, with the impact of Trump 2.0, there is a serious discussion, political discussion about this. Everyone recognizes that's what we should do. So at least there is, and now the conversation is about 3% rather than 2% of GDP. But the national politics of getting to that point, where our budgets are so strained, results of austerity, welfare budgets, education budgets, health budgets hit, and our economies are doing very badly, and our national debts are soaring also because of the COVID pandemic, are just unbelievably difficult. So I wouldn't count on it. And even if we did, we won't have an effective European defence if we go on all and each buying national, right? So it's not just the total money, it's the fact that Germany spends all its money in Germany and France all its money in France and Sweden all its money in Sweden, so you don't have a joined up European defence, right? So I think there's an intellectual recognition that that's what we're going to do, but I wouldn't bet a great deal of money on us actually doing it.
Tom Wiley, Oxford, can I thank you for your address and also for your splendid homelands book.
Thank you.
And I do that because we're in Bond Square and Oxford twinned with Maugham in 1946. That was brave move by people at that time. So I want you to give us a slightly more longer term and maybe even optimistic view of a longer term future. That is, the CDU will win the next German election and therefore hold off AfD. That the progressive forces in Poland will retake their presidency and the Republicans will get smashed in the midterms in America.
Wonderful. Look, I think it's a very important point. I mean, just to qualify it very slightly, I think the CDU will win, but the question is who will be their coalition partner, right? Because the German government's always coalition, and that can get much more tricky, and particularly if they need two coalition partners. But I'm so glad you mentioned Poland, and I would actually add to your more optimistic scenario Britain, because we turned it around too. And I mean, let's be clear, our democracy has really survived the test of Brexit. It was tested, but we come through. And Poland was remarkable, because in Poland, democracy had been half demolished. I mean, Kaczynski was half the way to Orwell's Hungary, which is no longer a democracy. And they turned it around because they mobilized. You had the very good campaign, good leader, largest turnout in Polish history, more women voted than men, more young people voted than old people. Amazing. So you're absolutely right. Ironically, on Trump, if he slaps on the tariffs, the effect of that, which he doesn't realize, but every economist does, is going to be inflation. Now, cost of living. Now, actually the biggest single factor that won him this election was the cost of living. So he may be preparing his own political funeral, which would be good news, although a very painful way to go there. But I wouldn't, I'm afraid, I'd love to give you more optimism, but I wouldn't be so optimistic about the European trend as a whole. I think we haven't passed peak populism. I think Putin is not ready to stop just with Ukraine. And I think the United States is turning away from Europe. So we have a real challenge on our hands.
You over there? You're next up.
Hi,
Yeah, it's on.
my name is Guillermo. I'm a researcher in the EU law at Somerset. My question is, building on what was previously asked about Poland, I'd be interested, because you know that part of Europe so well, what do you think was the key difference between Poland and Hungary in terms of why one of the countries was able to overcome sort of populist backsliding episode and the other wasn't? Is there a sort of legal element of, Kaczynski didn't go as far as Orban did because he wasn't able to change the constitution as much, but is there a civil society element? Was there some sort of mobilization over the years in Poland that there wasn't in Hungary? Can we learn anything from it in Europe as a whole?
Yes, you can learn a lot. So, first of all, individuals matter in history. Viktor Orban was our student here in Oxford in 1989. I've never forgotten him. I knew him from Budapest earlier in the 80s. Standing in my office in Church Walk, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, telling me how he's going to build a liberal democracy in Hungary. We identified Viktor Orban as the most skillful politician of his generation. We were not wrong. The trouble is he used his skills to demolish liberal democracy, not to build it. So that's a big factor. He's just very skillful. Number two, by actually a sort of historical fluke, he got a constitutional majority in Hungary in 2010, and therefore he actually changed the constitution multiple times, changed the political and legal system. That didn't happen in Poland. Factor number three, civil society. I mean, Poland, because of its whole history of being over hundreds of years, a country that didn't have a state because of the partitions, and so the nation lived through a self-organized society, way back to the early 19th century. And then you have Solidarność, the Solidarity movement, so it has incredibly strong civil society, strong media, strong independent TV, all of that. So that's factor number three. And then factor number four, the one I mentioned, to win an election you have to have a good campaign, and they had a great campaign. So I think there are plenty of good lessons to learn there. And actually, you know, for years we had democratization studies, transition studies. Then we had just started doing de-democratization studies, because there was clearly a de-democratization studies. And now we need to do re-democratization studies. And amusingly, there are even some people who are thinking that the United States should learn a lesson or two from Poland.
You're back there, you've been had a long time.
Hello, Laura Craig-Gray, just a resident of Oxford. You mentioned Trump's love of golf and royal family as being possible threads by which the special relationship might be maintained. I'm not sure I share that optimism. I'm curious about Elon Musk, where he fits into all this. I mean, he's supposed to be quite a busy man. He's got $2 trillion worth of cuts to bind, and yet he seems to spend an awful lot of his time tweeting that Britain's a police state, that civil war's inevitable, that we're a fascist state, that we're an Islamic state. He's quite preoccupied with this dislike of Britain, and he's clearly got the presidency in it. He's also got an awful lot of followers around the world. Do you think that he is a serious figure that we should be concerned about in terms of Britain's relationship with the United States?
Well, I don't think he's a serious figure, but I think he's a serious threat. Look, there have already been reports that he's losing Trump's ear, because you have these two vast erratic egos sort of clashing into each other and bouncing off each other. So I'm not sure that he will determine Trump's Britain policy. And God knows which way Trump will go. Trump himself doesn't know which way Trump will go. But I do think that Elon Musk is both a symptom and in a sense of a cause of the deformations of liberal democracy that have come through neoliberalism, right? Martin Wolf, in his excellent new book on democratic capitalism, says that the beauty of liberal democracy was that it separated wealth and power, right? So throughout most of recorded history, wealth and power have gone together. Liberal democracy separated them. Now, the trouble is, what's happened as a result of neoliberalism, globalized financialized capitalism, is that wealth and power come snap bang together again in oligarchs, in the great tech platforms, in people like Elon Musk, and then they're trading economic power for political power. So I think that's a huge structural problem of our democracies. And in part of this reform of liberalism, which I'm talking about, taxing the super rich much harder, limiting their power, limiting the power of the platforms, taxing the platforms, would be a really important part of the agenda.
You haven't said much about Ukraine. And thank you. Ukraine has a very strong civil society. I mean, we saw in the 2014 revolution how that hundreds of thousands stood together in the center of Kyiv until they changed the government. What is going to happen there? I mean, Putin is still bitten off a very difficult situation.
Well, but you know, your phrase "bitten off," you say "bitten off." That phrase normally ends more than he can chew. But my God, he's chewing, and how? I mean, the resistance is absolutely extraordinary. It's really heroic. As Peter mentioned, I was in Kharkiv just 2 months ago. Now, Kharkiv is a city so close to the Russian frontier that my interpreter could see from her balcony, could actually see the missiles taking off from Belgorod in Russia. And they take 30 seconds to get to Kharkiv, the missiles, right? So when you hear the air raid alarm, it's already too late, which does make it a little bit hair-raising, I have to say. But people carry on with this amazing courage, and carry on with ordinary life, carry on fighting, but the casualties are just immense. The average age of soldiers is over 40. They have been fighting non-stop for nearly 3 years. The recruitment of younger soldiers is going very, very slowly indeed. Because we haven't given them enough arms and ammunition and the high-tech weapons, they've had to sacrifice men, right? So at the front line, if you had the weapons and the anti-aircraft and the artillery rounds, you could see off the enemy without having to put in your infantry, but because they didn't have the weapons, their men have been dying. So, and the Eastern Front is receding, is giving way at a faster rate than at any time since 2022. So the military situation on the ground is dramatic for Ukraine. The economic situation, for example, in Kharkiv, 70% of the businesses have either left or been destroyed, 70%. Half the country's energy infrastructure has been destroyed. If you think it's cold today, try Ukrainian winter, -10, -15, -20. So, look, at the moment Ukraine is losing. Ukraine is losing. And then now you've got Trump. Now you've got Trump, who's saying, I'm going to pull the rug from under you. So the situation is truly dramatic. And unless we as Europeans step up and say we're going to do more to support them, militarily, economically, diplomatically, this war is going to end badly for Ukraine. And you're going to have a country which is defeated, divided, demoralized, depopulated, because a lot more people are going to leave. Instead of the wives and children coming back from Germany and Britain to rejoin the husbands are going to join the wives and children in the West, which is going to be good for our economy, but terrible for Ukraine, and a country which is incredibly bitter against the West. Something that struck me last time in September when I was in Kiev and Kharkiv was just the bitterness already against the West. The West doesn't have the courage to stand up for its own values. The West is weak, the West is decadent, and so on. And you'll get that in spades. So I'm sorry to be so depressing, but it's a really critical moment where we as Europeans have to step up to do more for Ukraine.
Shall we ask you?
Hi, and thanks very much for the magnificent talk. I'm Maugham from European Movement UK, actually. I'm an advisor to the staff team. And I live in Brussels, hence my question. You've said, and this is exactly the same experience that I have every day in Brussels, that the UK is no longer part of the conversation. People aren't talking practice. So, if you were speaking to leading European politicians, which I know you do, what arguments would you use to convince them that the UK should be back on the European table and that they should be making moves towards the UK and in the medium term have a perspective towards the UK coming back into the fold? And just as a remark in addition to that, I think there's often a tendency, understandably, for all of us to be very, very negative about the UK. But we have to be positive about the UK to persuade the rest of Europe to want us back.
Yeah.
So what would you say to
Yeah, I would say Putin, Trump, Stalin. Just as simple as that we are in this new period of European history, where in this completely different geopolitical context has utterly changed from 2016, and with these huge threats from East and West, and actually all those changed global context, you need Britain. But to be honest with you, it's kind of cheeky of us, having been such a pain in the backside for Europe. I can't tell you know if you live in Brussels. I mean, our European partners, friends, were just so fed up with us. We were such an pain in the neck for so long over Brexit that it's a bit cheeky of us, to immediately to come along and say, you've got to take us more seriously, you've got to cut us a special thing. So I actually think that we have to go out front and make credible our own commitment to Europe first. And I sort of feel I was critical of the Starmer government, but I think they've sort of understood this, that you have to make a kind of down payment in terms of rhetoric and reaching out and constructiveness. But as I say, the economic policy thing and the question of how you respond to Trump is going to be a litmus test.
Lots of questions. Thank you. Sorry. Making it visible.
Thank you very much, Oshin, political theory university. So I was wondering, as a question of political psychology, how do you view the youth, both in continental Europe and also here in the UK? How do you view the youth and the European identity? The notion that we can identify not only with our nation state, but also as Europeans. I think that is an issue already in European countries themselves, but in the UK it's increasingly so. And simply as we can see around, there's very many young people. Good as always they've come. But yes, how do you think we can promote that in particular amongst the youth insofar as they, us, will be the ones who will be spearheading the regional project in the future? Thank you.
Great question about youth in Europe. If I can commend to you our project called Europe Stories. I don't know if you know that, but if you go to a website called europeanmoments.com, we did a 2-year project on young Europeans, both opinion polling and many interviews which are online and qualitative research, understanding their priorities. Climate change was obviously very high. Most striking finding was, aside from peace, the thing that young Europeans most value about the European Union is freedom of movement. Stunning result from one opinion poll. 74% of Europeans said the European Union wouldn't be worth having without freedom of movement. Stunning result. So that's that. So my first part of my answer to you would be, we have to go where young Europeans actually are, see what matters to them, and then try and address that, rather than projecting our own vision. But the second thing I would say, and I'm guessing you're hinting at this, is that, shall we say, older Europeans, whom I count myself, tend to have a slightly rose-tinted view of young Europeans as sort of always being more pro-European, right? That's our sort of cliche. Now, if you look at the voting figures, it ain't necessarily so. More young French voted for Le Pen than voted for Macron. The hard-right parties, for example in Poland, Confederacja, has a very strong youth component. And it's sort of understandable, because the thing you come into is this thing my generation and older generations have created, which is this sort of, broadly speaking, liberal integrated Europe, which isn't offering you a great deal, right? Or many people think. And so what's attractive is going back to something else, the nation, for example. So we also have to think rather hard, and this connects to the point about the white working class, about how we really address the concerns of those young Europeans who take a look at Europe in the sense of European Union and say, it doesn't work for me, I want something else.
Okay. More questions? Shall we ask you first and then on to you?
Michael Haywood, I'm a
denigrator about what Europe has to offer. But even with seemingly pro-European newspaper, which you're writing, is giving sort of guarded approval. There's no single medium which has ever gone full on saying the benefits that Europe has brought. And they are democracy, guaranteed peace within the European Union, and a broad measure of agreement on a welfare state. So these are colossal advantages which are lost. And I would say also, how on earth do we convert the Conservatives towards more pro-European stance? And especially the Reform Brigade, if they then join the Conservatives, this will make our present government lose a lot of seats and will change the position in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, there are two questions there to answer. You're absolutely right. One reason Labour won big was that Reform with Farage split the right-wing vote. Look, the media point is obviously crucial. I mean, one of the main causes of Brexit, and there are several, was the Eurosceptic press. The fact that roughly 80%, actually the Reuters Institute here at Oxford did a study on this, roughly 80% of the British print media were consistently pushing a Eurosceptic narrative, and that not only impacted the readers directly, but in this country it set the news cycle, right? So the radio and TV would pick this up. So there's a big problem. I would say for The Guardian, though, since you mentioned The Guardian, that after long last we now have a European homepage. I don't know if you read it online, but if you go online to the top right, you can click down, and there's the US homepage, Australia, and there's the Europe. And we've got some new European columnists, we have 4 new pan-European correspondents, so we're trying to do something, and what we're trying to do, and I do want to say this, is the first job of journalism, which is not propaganda. It's not making the case, as you were slightly suggesting, for the European Union. I can do that as a columnist. It is simply reporting accurately and in depth what Europe is, how Europe is, with all its beauties and all its, inadequacies. And that's what we're most missing, I think, is detailed, in-depth reporting of Europe. So I'm slightly proud of what at least The Guardian is trying to do. Last question, maybe.
Huge with Europe. Going back for a moment to Ukraine, the subject of Ukraine and Europe's response to the Ukrainian situation, one country which has been consistently the outlier in European resolutions about support for Ukraine has been Hungary, blocking, at least rhetorically, European resolutions about greater support to Ukraine. And even prior to 2022, within his own country, Orwell eventually changing the constitution, suppressing opposition, undermining academic freedom, judicial independence, press freedom, in other words, breaking every rule book in the European Union in terms of its values and basic principles. So my question is, what more does Hungary have to do before it is expelled from the European Union? And why is it not being expelled already?
Well, I mean, listen, it's a great question. Hungary's a country close to my heart. I've written about this a lot. And, the sad fact is, Britain has left the European Union, but remains a democracy. Hungary remains in the European Union, but is no longer a democracy. And that's an absolutely shocking fact. I mean, as I said, Orwell, this very skillful politician, has got away with murder. He's worked it out. That once you're a full member state of the European Union, it has no effective means of disciplining you. If you're an applicant country, if you're trying to get in, then it has lots of instruments. It's very effective, but once you're inside, you can get away with murder. And he is now, I mean, it's unbelievable. Because not only that he's destroyed democracy in his own country, he's also going off to meet Vladimir Putin to quote-unquote negotiate peace and getting cheap gas for his country, and Xi Jinping. And he is now the favored target for Chinese investment in Europe. In other words, do you remember I talked about the post-Western world and these transactional powers? He's behaving like a Turkey or a Brazil or an India. He's multi-aligning. And all that as a full member state of the EU. So your question is absolutely crucial to the entire future of the European Union. Because if he and Hungary continue to get away with that, the European Union ceases to be a community of democracies, it ceases to be a community of law, because one part of its own legal system is illegal, and it ceases to be any sort of unity, right? Because he can go off and do it. So I think, I think this is an issue that has been, sidelined and underestimated for a very, very long time. For example, one of the things I say in my review of Merkel's memoirs is, she, the East German, the East European, should have seen this happening and tried to stop it. Germany has enormous economic power in Hungary, right? But she didn't do anything to stop it. And so for me, that is one of the 3 or 4 big tests of the European Union in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Will it get serious about enforcing its own values in its own member states? And I wish we were there too, to be part of that conversation. But that's going to take a year or 2.
But that's time has caught up with us. 9:45, and just really time to say a very special word of thank you. And I cannot say enough how inspiring it is to hear Timothy talking, and I think you'll all agree with me. Hopefully, you'll all agree also that his students are extremely lucky. Generations of students have come through his humanities, not just Victor Orban, but many others.
He was one of our failures, yes.
And indeed, I think he's given us an example of how we can speak with authority and depth and feeling about these very important issues. So, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.